The 1950s were supposed to be all about optimism, shiny cars, cheerful suburbs, and families smiling on black and white television. But if you walked into a theater back then, you'd see something far different. Sci-fi films of the era weren't just pulp distractions. They were warnings, experiments, and sometimes chilling previews of the world we actually live in now. So the real question is, which of these mid-century shockers saw the future before anyone else? Let's find out. Destination Moon, 1950. Forget little green visitors and glowing saucers. Destination Moon was one of the first American films to treat space travel as a serious business, and it didn't pull punches. Released in 1950, this George Powell production focused on the practical challenges of building a rocket, calculating weight, and surviving on the airless surface of the moon. It didn't feel like a fantasy, it felt like a plan. The story followed scientists and private investors working together to launch the very first manned lunar mission. Not for conquest, but for the sheer belief that the United States had to reach space first. What set this movie apart was its startling realism. The production hired technical advisors, leaned heavily on actual rocketry, math, and even included animated sequences to explain complex science to audiences. Instead of rubber costumes, the film showed spindly lunar landers, bulky spacesuits, and the eerie silence of the moon's barren landscape. For viewers expecting laser beams and bug-eyed aliens, the realism was more unsettling than any monster. Critics at the time called it overly earnest. Yet less than 20 years later, when Apollo astronauts stepped onto the real lunar surface, the resemblance was uncanny. Even the film's fragile lander looked strikingly similar to the real NASA design. Destination Moon predicted not only the technology, but the politics and pride that would define the space race. It may have looked like science fiction in 1950, but history proved it was closer to a preview reel. Sometimes, sincerity beats spectacle. Rocketship X-M 1950. Here's a case of a low-budget rush job that stumbled into prophecy. Rocketship X-M was rushed into theaters in 1950 to beat Destination Moon to release, and it looked every bit like a cut-rate project. Sets were cheap, special effects were recycled, and dialogue was melodramatic. But buried inside this B-movie was a chilling vision that rings uncomfortably true. The film follows a crew aiming for the moon, only to veer off course and crash land on Mars. Instead of discovering a thriving alien world, they find a dead planet scarred by the ruins of an ancient civilization. The cause of that ruin? The Martians had once unleashed atomic devastation on themselves, reducing their once prosperous home into a barren wasteland. It was a mirror held up to humanity, warning what could happen if we let our own technology spiral out of control. At the time, the Cold War had just begun, and audiences were still grappling with the implications of atomic power. The film dared to suggest that entire planets could be undone by their own inventions. Today, when scientists study dry riverbeds and cratered landscapes on Mars, some believe the planet may once have had oceans and possibly life. Now the movie feels less like pulp and more like a metaphor for planetary fragility. Despite its flaws, Rocketship X-M asked a haunting question. Do advanced civilizations always end up destroying themselves? That's a query that feels as relevant in 2025 as it did in 1950. Sometimes the cheapest production carries the sharpest message. The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1951. Imagine a flying saucer landing on the White House lawn. Out steps a figure who looks human but carries a warning sharper than any sword. That was The Day the Earth Stood Still, released in 1951, at the height of Cold War anxiety. But instead of showing hostile invaders, this film forced audiences to look inward. The visitor, Klaatu, doesn't demand submission or conquest. He delivers a stark message. Humanity's new obsession with atomic energy could threaten not just Earth, but the wider galaxy. By his side is Gort, a towering robot that responds only when provoked, a quiet metaphor for automated power that can be triggered without thought. In an era where machines increasingly carry out tasks once controlled by people, that theme feels downright prophetic. What makes this film timeless isn't its saucer, but its moral mirror. Instead of making aliens the villains, it framed humans as suspicious, violent, and too short-sighted to see the bigger picture. Even Bernard Herrmann's eerie electronic score added to the unnerving mood, suggesting this wasn't just entertainment. It was a sermon about responsibility. Today, with debates about artificial intelligence, autonomous technology, and global peacekeeping, the message feels sharper than ever. If a rational voice of reason landed in front of us, would we actually listen, or would we panic and react? That's the haunting question this film still leaves us with. Nearly 75 years later, it hasn't lost its sting. When Worlds Collide, 1951. Now picture this. Scientists discover a rogue star hurtling toward Earth. They sound the alarm, plead for preparation. And yet, governments stall. Meanwhile, ordinary people argue and panic. That's When Worlds Collide, released in 1951, and it's uncomfortably familiar. The movie follows a desperate race to build an Ark ship that can carry a chosen few survivors to another planet before Earth is completely destroyed. Special effects at the time wowed audiences, cities toppling, oceans boiling, fire consuming everything. But the real drama was in the ethical dilemma. Who gets to survive? Who chooses the passengers? Is it the wealthy, the talented, or simply the lucky? That question cut deep in the 1950s, and it still cuts deep now. Modern scientists map asteroid paths, draft emergency plans, and talk about colonizing Mars as a backup for humanity. When Worlds Collide imagined those very debates decades earlier, and it didn't sugarcoat them. The film made audiences confront the uncomfortable truth that survival is rarely fair. Someone always gets left behind. Looking back, it was one of the first doomsday films to treat its premise with real seriousness. No rubber suits, no corny gimmicks, just the terror of a ticking clock and the cold math of survival. In that sense, it wasn't just science fiction. It was a rehearsal for conversations we're still having. That's why it still resonates, because it asked the question we'd rather avoid. The Thing from Another World, 1951. Buried in Arctic ice, a discovery waits. A team of researchers uncovers a frozen figure, preserved for who knows how long. At first, it's a miracle. Then the ice melts, and curiosity turns to dread. This is The Thing from Another World, released in 1951, and it's one of the most influential films of the era. Unlike the bombastic, city-destroying stories of the decade, this one kept its terror contained. The setting was an isolated outpost. The cast, a mix of scientists and Air Force personnel, trapped with a being they barely understood. What emerged wasn't a humanoid with flashy gadgets, but a plant-like organism with a hunger that defied logic. The horror wasn't just about the monster. It was about isolation, paranoia, and the consequences of discovery. Here's where the prophecy creeps in. The film anticipated two very real debates: the risks of remote research bases and the dangers of introducing alien microbes to Earth. Today, agencies like NASA and the European Space Agency strictly enforce planetary protection rules, making sure nothing brought back from Mars or Europa could unleash chaos on Earth. That idea was fantasy in the 1950s, but The Thing nailed it decades ahead of schedule. Its final line, "Keep watching the skies," became a mantra of its time, a warning wrapped in pulp. And in the 21st century, with telescopes scanning for asteroids and satellites tracking unidentified phenomena, we are still following that advice. This wasn't just a creature feature. It was a blueprint for caution. It came from Outer Space 1953. At a time when nearly every sci-fi flick screamed they're here to destroy us, It Came from Outer Space whispered something completely different. Released in 1953 and based on a concept from Ray Bradbury, this film had the nerve to suggest that maybe, just maybe, aliens weren't villains at all. The story takes place in the Arizona desert, where a strange object crashes from the sky. Locals quickly assume the worst, and invasion is underway. In reality, the extraterrestrials are simply stranded travelers trying to repair their ship. To survive in secret, they assume human form, which only fuels paranoia among the townspeople. Before long, panic takes over. It wasn't a war, it was a misunderstanding. That was the genius of this movie. Instead of showcasing an epic battle for Earth, it served up a thoughtful parable about fear of the unknown. In an era dominated by suspicion and conformity, the idea that different didn't equal danger was revolutionary. Audiences expecting lasers and destruction got a story about empathy versus paranoia. Visually, the film stood out too. Early three-dimensional effects gave desert backdrops an eerie, shimmering quality, and the aliens, seen only in distorted glimpses, avoided cartoonish tropes while still unsettling viewers. It was sci-fi as a mirror, not a hammer. Today, as scientists listen for signals from the stars, the question remains: if contact happens, do we greet it with openness or fear? It Came from Outer Space predicted that the real danger isn't out there, It's in how we react. The War of the Worlds, 1953. Few images are as unforgettable as a quiet meteor in a field cracking open to reveal annihilation inside. George Pal's The War of the Worlds, released in 1953, turned H.G. Wells's classic novel into a spectacle that terrified Cold War audiences. The Martians weren't goofy little figures. They were sleek machines gliding across landscapes, unleashing destruction with eerie humming heat rays. Watching Los Angeles crumble under fiery blasts was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. But beyond the explosions, the real prophecy was in the ending. Humanity threw everything at the invaders. Tanks, planes, bombs, and none of it worked. Victory didn't come from our technology. It came from biology. The Martians fell to germs so small they were invisible. At the time, it was a shocking twist. Today, after global health crises have humbled entire nations, it feels hauntingly familiar. Nature, often ignored or underestimated, proved to be the ultimate equalizer. The film also nailed the mood of its moment. Cold War dread hung over everything, and the story tapped into those fears by showing how fragile even the strongest powers could be. The sound design, especially that unforgettable heat ray hum, became legend. Critics once dismissed it as flashy pulp, but its themes run deeper. The War of the Worlds warned us that our survival often depends not on the mightiest invention, but on the smallest overlooked detail. That lesson still holds. Them, 1954. A little girl wandering the desert in shock, clutching a broken doll. That's how Them opened, and it immediately set a chilling tone. Released in 1954, it became the defining giant creature movie of the decade. But it wasn't just a spectacle. It was a parable. The monsters turned out to be ants, mutated to enormous size by atomic testing. They hissed, shrieked, and marched across the desert with terrifying force. But what made them stick wasn't the insect effects, though they were impressive for the time. It was the underlying message. These weren't really monsters. They were consequences. The film took the brand new atomic age and asked what might happen when humanity meddled with forces it barely understood. By framing the ants as a byproduct of radiation, the movie connected entertainment to real-world unease. Scientists at the time were still grappling with the long-term effects of nuclear fallout. Audiences didn't just gasp at the creatures, they recognized the metaphor. The production treated the subject with deadly seriousness. No campy one-liners or winking jokes. Scientists and military personnel in the movie behaved like professionals facing an unprecedented crisis. That gave it weight, turning pulp into prophecy. Even today, when discussions about climate shifts, genetic experiments, and artificial intelligence dominate headlines, the warning from Them still echoes. When we tinker with forces beyond our control, the fallout may be larger than we ever imagined. The Magnetic Monster, 1953. In 1953, audiences walked into theaters expecting another cheesy monster flick. Instead, they got a surprisingly serious science lesson wrapped in tension. The Magnetic Monster wasn't about giant insects or alien invasions. It was about energy itself, a concept far scarier than rubber costumes. The story followed two government agents investigating strange incidents linked to a mysterious new element. This substance fed on energy, growing stronger every time it consumed electricity. Left unchecked, it threatened to become so massive that its gravitational pull could tear the planet apart. It was a wild premise, but behind the pulp was a very real concern. What happens when we unleash forces we don't fully understand? The film leaned heavily on scientific detail, even incorporating stock footage from a German film about atomic research. Instead of thrills through explosions, it delivered dread through equations and calculations. That made it feel eerily plausible. Audiences saw not just a story, but a warning about the risks of unchecked energy experiments, long before debates about nuclear safety and renewable technology entered the mainstream. Visually, the Magnetic Monster lacked the flash of its bigger-budget peers, but its ideas gave it weight. It suggested that humanity's thirst for power, literally and figuratively, could spin beyond our control. In a world now powered by nuclear plants, fusion experiments, and vast energy grids, the prophecy has only grown sharper. The Magnetic Monster may not be the best-known sci-fi film of the decade, but its vision of energy as both savior and threat makes it one of the most eerily accurate. Sometimes the real monster isn't alien at all. It's the invisible power humming in our walls. This Island Earth, 1955. It begins with a strange package in the mail, parts for a device no one on Earth could have built. Put it together, and suddenly you're in contact with another world. That was the hook of This Island Earth, released in 1955, and it was one of the boldest sci-fi films of its time. The story followed Dr. Cal Meacham, a scientist drawn into a mysterious program run by beings who turn out to be emissaries from the planet Metaluna. Their world is collapsing under war, and they recruit Earth's brightest minds not to conquer, but to help. That twist was unusual for the 50s. Instead of aliens as invaders, they were collaborators seeking survival. Visually, the film dazzled with glowing laboratories, strange consoles, and the unforgettable Metaluna mutant, a bug-eyed figure that terrified audiences. But beneath the spectacle was a surprisingly modern prophecy. Maybe First Contact won't be about domination. Maybe it'll be about cooperation. Looking back, it feels like a metaphor for scientific partnerships today. Think about the International Space Station, the Large Hadron Collider, or global collaborations in medicine. Survival and progress often depend on sharing knowledge across borders. Critics at the time dismissed the movie as flashy pulp, but its core question lingers. Can intelligence endure if it refuses to cooperate? For a 1955 feature, that was a startlingly visionary theme. Forbidden Planet, 1956. Forget dime store monsters in rubber suits. Forbidden Planet was high art disguised as science fiction. Released in 1956, it took Shakespeare's The Tempest and reimagined it in space. The result was a dazzling spectacle that broke the mold of mid-century sci-fi and asked questions we're still grappling with today. The story follows Commander Adams and his crew as they land on the planet Altair 4 to investigate a missing colony. They discover Dr. Morbius and his daughter, the last survivors, living amid the ruins of an alien civilization known as the Krell. Morbius has tapped into their advanced technology, gaining knowledge far beyond human limits. But there's a catch. His subconscious fears manifest as a destructive, invisible force. The monster, it turns out, isn't alien at all. It's human nature magnified by power. That twist was decades ahead of its time. Forbidden Planet warned that technology could amplify our darkest impulses, a prophecy that feels eerily familiar in the age of algorithms and artificial intelligence. The more advanced the tools, the greater the risk of them reflecting our flaws back at us. Visually, the film was groundbreaking. Cinemascope landscapes, futuristic designs, and of course, Robbie the Robot, who became an icon in his own right. Its influence is clear in everything from Star Trek to 2001, A Space Odyssey. The real legacy, though, is its central question. What happens when our intellect races ahead of our wisdom? Forbidden Planet dared to suggest that the biggest monster isn't out there in the stars, it's inside us. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1956. You wake up one morning and realize your neighbor looks the same, talks the same, but something is missing. No warmth, no spark. That was the nightmare fueling Invasion of the Body Snatchers, released in 1956, and it remains one of the most haunting films of the decade. Set in a quiet California town, the story follows Dr. Miles Bennell as he uncovers a terrifying secret. Alien pods are duplicating people while they sleep, leaving behind perfect replicas, physically identical but drained of all emotion. The horror wasn't in explosions or flashy effects. It was in the subtle dread of realizing your loved ones weren't really themselves anymore. Interpretations varied. Some saw it as a metaphor for the paranoia of the McCarthy era, others as a critique of conformity in post-war America. But stripped of politics, the film still resonates because it taps into a timeless fear, losing individuality in a world that demands sameness. Kevin McCarthy's frantic final scene, running down a highway screaming, "You're next," remains iconic. Decades later, the story feels prophetic in unexpected ways. In an age where digital personas blur with reality and algorithms predict our behavior, the fear of being replaced by something hollow is more relevant than ever. Invasion of the Body Snatchers didn't need giant monsters to terrify us. It showed that the scariest invasion is the one that steals our humanity quietly, right under our noses. The Incredible Shrinking Man, 1957. Not all sci-fi looked outward to galaxies. Some dared to look inward. The Incredible Shrinking Man, released in 1957, took audiences on a journey that was equal parts terrifying and philosophical. The film follows Scott Carey, an ordinary man exposed to a strange mist. Soon after, he begins to shrink. At first, it's an odd curiosity. Then, it becomes a nightmare. A once normal home turns into a death trap. A cat becomes a predator. A leaking faucet becomes a waterfall of doom. The oversized sets and clever visual effects made these dangers pulse with realism. But the real brilliance wasn't the spectacle. It was the emotion. As Scott grows smaller, his marriage collapses, his pride erodes, and his very sense of self dissolves. In the haunting final act, he shrinks beyond visibility, slipping into the subatomic world. Instead of despair, he finds wonder, realizing that existence continues on every scale. That closing monologue still gives chills. What seemed like fantasy in the 1950s now feels eerily prophetic. The film foreshadowed our fascination with nanotechnology, quantum mechanics, and the idea of infinite universes hidden in the tiniest particles. The Incredible Shrinking Man wasn't just about size, it was about identity, dignity, and finding meaning when the world no longer fits. For a film about one man getting smaller, its themes remain enormous. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, 1954. Yes, the story was first imagined by Jules Verne in the 19th century, but Disney's lavish 1954 adaptation made it feel like a prophecy. At its heart was Captain Nemo's Nautilus, a submarine unlike anything the world had ever seen on screen. Sleek, futuristic, and powered by an atomic-like energy source, it was decades ahead of reality. Only months after the film's release, life imitated art. The U.S. Navy launched the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. Suddenly, the impossible vision in Disney's blockbuster had become reality. The film itself was an adventure epic. Professor Aronnax, Ned Land, and Nemo plunged into the deep in a vessel that blurred the line between ship and sanctuary. Audiences were dazzled by underwater photography, technicolor beauty, and of course the unforgettable battle with a giant squid. James Mason's portrayal of Nemo as both brilliant and tortured gave the story weight far beyond its family-friendly surface. But beneath the spectacle was a sobering message. Nemo had escaped empires, wars, and politics, but he couldn't escape his own conscience. His submarine was both freedom and prison, a metaphor for how even technological marvels can't free us from ourselves. Looking back, what stands out is how closely the Nautilus anticipated today's submarines, deep-sea research craft, and even off-grid sustainable technology. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea wasn't just a movie, it was a blueprint for the oceanic future. The Fly, 1958. Closing out the decade is The Fly, released in 1958, a film that fused body horror with big questions about science and ambition. It begins with a brilliant scientist experimenting with teleportation technology. His goal? To break matter down in one chamber and reassemble it perfectly in another. The catch? A tiny housefly sneaks into the machine with him. The result is a horrifying transformation. The man emerges fused with the insect, his body grotesquely altered, his humanity slipping away. On the surface, it was a chilling thriller that left audiences shaken. But beneath the drama was a prophecy about tampering with the unknown. In the 1950s, teleportation was pure fantasy. Yet the film's themes about matter transmission, genetic mixing, and unintended consequences feel strikingly modern. Today, scientists experiment with quantum teleportation on the smallest scales, while advances in genetic engineering raise questions about how far we should go in altering life. The Fly captured both the wonder and danger of scientific ambition. Its message was clear. Progress without caution can lead to transformations we may not be ready for. The story lingered long after the credits rolled, because it wasn't just about a man and a machine. It was about humanity standing at the edge of possibility, staring into the unknown. Decades later, The Fly still buzzes with relevance. It was the perfect capstone to a decade of sci-fi prophecy. And there you have it, 15 films from the 1950s that weren't just Saturday matinee thrills. They were eerie roadmaps, predicting space, travel, artificial intelligence, pandemics, environmental fallout, and even questions of identity. What critics once dismissed as pulp turned out to be the cinema's crystal ball. So, which one of these mid-century visions do you think nailed the future best? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe for more deep-cut movie history. The atomic age may be long gone, but its prophecies are still unfolding.